Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
Why I think the future of 99% of African nations or countries is still gloomy and shows no sign of hope. Please, subscribe, share, and comment. Thank you. I suppose all black Africans wish to see their countries or Africa develop, not like the so-called Western developed countries, but like China or the emerging Asian countries. Indeed, the Chinese development model augurs more hope, happiness, and peace than the American and European models. In African countries, unfortunately, the Western imperialists have laid and continue to lay down many barriers on the path of their development. Besides, Africa constantly faces internal treason that black Africans refuse to address or combat. Black Africans must overcome all these barriers before they are able to set their countries in Africa on the path of economic, political, social, and technological development and progress. Where there is a will, there's a way. But do all black Africans want their countries in Africa as a whole to develop? I don't think so. I'm not pessimistic, but I'm not too optimistic about the future of 99% of African countries because black Africans are still incapable of dealing with the forces that have been holding Africa back, and black Africans are not assertive whatsoever in the world full of vampires. In this video I would like to talk about the major barriers that have been undermining the development and progress of African countries or Africa. There are many forces or barriers that must be dealt with, and there is a mindset among black Africans that must change before African countries or Africa advance and prosper. Leadership, currently in African countries, is a major barrier to the development and advancement of Africa. The leadership of the so-called African presidents doesn't benefit all black Africans but only a minority because imperialists and foreigners are actually the ones who run everything behind the scene in Africa. European and American imperialists have been imposing leaders on Africans through rigged elections or systematic violence. Leadership in Africa means corruption and tribalism at the same time. The African so-called presidents are not leaders but puppets and thugs installed and controlled by the Western imperialists. The way African so-called leaders, their entourage, and families behave shows that they despise their fellow countrymen and they have no empathy for them. The African so-called governing elite even enjoys seeing their fellow countrymen living in misery, just like Europeans and Americans enjoy seeing black people suffering. This elite has no understanding at all of collective interest or prosperity. The so-called African leaders believe that their social status make them supreme over their countrymen. They think they have power and the right to mistreat their fellow countrymen, to dispossess their fellow countrymen of their lands, or to jail their fellow countrymen at will. Because of its behavior and mindset, the so-called African governing elite, as well as the so-called African law enforcement officers and soldiers, are actually the uncivilized group among Africans. The African so-called leaders see their status and job titles as permission to behave however they want to or to indulge themselves in a lavish lifestyle to the detriment of their fellow countrymen. This is the reason most of the so-called African presidents want to be president for life or have no shame clinging onto power by resorting to all means, including violence and savagery. To say the least, their attitude and behavior are similar to those of the slave masters in the slave plantations. Some individuals in the African so-called governing elite even work daily alongside white Europeans or Westerners, and others even brag often about having white friends. In African countries, it is not rare to see European or American individuals who are hired as employees in strategic political departments, and it is very common to see non-elected European or American individuals who seat in the Parliament or National Assembly of African countries.
I worked in South Africa in 2017 and 2018 for their National Assembly, and I was able to meet some of these characters because they have a party in the parliament there called the Vryheid something first party.
Worse, it is very common for France to send French so-called jurists to the French-speaking African countries in order to change the country's constitution in favor of an acting president. Even Idriss Déby, the former president of Chad and father of the current Chadian president, said during an interview on a French television shortly before his assassination that France sent a jurist to Chad to change his country's constitution in his favor when he decided in 2006 not to run again for president.
2006, il devrait céder en fait, disons.
Il y a 10 ans.
Au suivant. Et comme j'ai dit dans la politique africaine, la France intervient souvent. Et je le dis haut
In
et fort.
2006, I had to hand over power to the next
Je
person.
dis bien, je n'ai pas
And as I
demandé,
say in
je dis,
African
je ne fais
politics,
pas
France often intervenes.
de changer la
I say loud and clear that France intervened, even though I didn't ask. It was France that changed the constitution. I refused, and I didn't campaign for the presidential election that year. It's always France that does it, it's always France that criticizes, and it's always France that's behind it. The constitutionalist that France sent to Chad to change the constitution, I don't even know his name. I said no, that I wouldn't change the constitution. The French went through their wits, since Africa is France's property, to change Chad's constitution in my favor. Have you ever seen black African individuals who were hired by the United States to seat in the American Congress or who are employed by European countries at their Department of Defense? The answer is no. However, European and American individuals are employed in strategic departments and institutions by many African countries, and it is a sad reality. This is why in Africa nothing seems to move or has ever gone in the right direction since the end of the ancient time. The so-called African leaders today have no understanding of leadership, and they are like sheep that has no compass and goal. To them, leadership means engaging in all sort of stupidity to please their Western masters. Doing so, they have not only made their nations but also Africa the laughingstock for the world. The so-called African leaders never had a vision because their Western masters told them not to have a vision or development projects. These leaders are only good at wasting their country's resources and enriching themselves and the Europeans to the detriment of their fellow countrymen, as if their countries are their personal properties. The African so-called leaders have created for themselves a different world that isolates them from the misery and sufferings their fellow countrymen live in, and their near-empty heads are filled with ideas of megalomania and extravagance. Of all that precedes, it is clear that leadership by itself doesn't exist in African countries. Leadership in Africa is synonymous with corruption. The so-called African leaders are not leaders, but thugs, criminals, and narcissists. When African so-called leaders constantly lack a vision for their countries, have no desire to build up their countries, disregard their country's constitutions, run their country like family properties, steal their country's resources, collude with foreigners to loot their countries, consciously drown their countries in colossal debts, sabotage their countries, or don't care about their fellow countrymen living in poverty and misery, there is no way one can envisage any development and progress in African countries. Because of their stupidity, their constant looting of public resources, their megalomania, and insouciance, the so-called African leaders have unfortunately made Africa the face of corruption, chaos, despair, misery, and ridicule on the earth. I bet you that African so-called presidents are billionaires just for being presidents. The money stolen by these African so-called presidents doesn't even benefit their countries but outsiders, because they stash this money in foreign banks, mostly European and American. When Mobutu Sese Seko, a former president of DR Congo, or Sani Abacha, a former Nigerian president, died, they had more than 20 billion American dollars scattered in Swiss and American banks in their names. Until today, these banks have kept for themselves the stolen money and have given only a few millions dollars back to Nigeria.
So get this, the United States has agreed to return about $23 million to Nigeria, taken by former military ruler Sani Abacha. Nigeria also has other agreements in order to recoup money stolen over the years from the government. Abacha, who ruled Nigeria in 1993 up until 1998, when he subsequently passed away, managed to take up to $5 billion in public money. We're joined by Martin Ihembe from the University of Pretoria to understand how this process will unfold. Thank you very much, Mr. Ihembe, for availing yourself this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with a brief history lesson. Who is Sani Abacha?
Okay, yes. Good evening, good afternoon here. Sani Abacha was the former military head of state that ruled Nigeria between 1994 up until 1998. He died sort of mysteriously while in office.
The so-called national armies in African countries don't protect the interests of these countries but the interests of the imperialists and other foreigners. The European and American imperialists have successfully taken control of African national armies, using bribery or intimidation tactics. This is why European and American imperialists have been able to set up military bases in many African countries. They have been violating the sovereignty of countries and the rights and freedom of Africans to decide or choose for themselves for decades. The African national armies are not army but militias or ethnic armed forces composed of criminals that take orders from Europeans and Americans, just like the so-called African leaders do. If you wonder why African national armies are very loyal to African sellout presidents and dictators, or why they rarely step in to protect their countries from external and internal threats, now you have the answer. Besides the fact that European and American have been able to impose puppet leaders on Africans and replace African national armies with a militia or ethnic armed forces, they have also managed to take control of African regional and continental organizations. African regional and continental organizations don't work in the interests of black Africans but of Western imperialists and other foreigners, because these imperialists and foreigners are actually the ones who maneuver everything behind the scene in Africa. The budget of African regional and continental organizations is financed up to 80% by the European Union and the United States. Therefore, these African organizations are like a tool in the hands of the Western imperialists, as they don't serve at all the interests of Africa and Africans. The so-called African regional and continental organizations receive orders from France, the European Union, or United States, and they also report to France, the European Union, or United States. It was not a miracle when France convinced in July 2023 the West African States Economic Community or ECOWAS to military attack Niger in order to remove the country's newly military junta that is approved by the people of Niger. There is nothing surprising about African regional organizations and the African Union not being able to pacify the African continent, to roll out their own peacekeeping missions in unstable African countries, to send enough observers to supervise elections in African countries, ensure fair and democratic elections in African countries, ensure the well-being of Africans, etc. In fact, most Africans who work in these organizations have been carrying out exactly the evil plans of the imperialists in Africa. Like the worthless regional African organizations and the African Union, many black Africans also engage very often in spying and undermining activities against their countries and Africa. This is due to the fact that Africa's educational institutions, which are legacies of colonialism, don't teach or inculcate patriotism and collective interests into African children. Now, what is the solution? Elections and political reforms are not the solution for Africa's problems. Africa's problems need a radical and hard approach. The worthless African Union, African regional organizations, and Africa's educational and religious institutions must be dismantled. Most importantly, black Africans must get rid of their subservient mindset, and they must get rid of all their current so-called leaders either through revolutions or by other means. This will be the first step. After this, they must appoint individuals from the grassroots as their leaders by themselves. During the time of leadership of these individuals, African countries must cut their ties and bilateral relations with European countries and the United States, something more radical than what President Captain Ibrahim Traoré is doing right now in Burkina Faso. Africans must turn temporarily to Russia and China to heavily arm themselves. They must focus on food self-sufficiency by boosting African agriculture. They must turn again temporarily to Russia and China for a full-scale industrialization. And they must finally turn to Russia and China for a military cooperation because the barbarians are out there, as Nicolas Sarkozy said. The former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, for the first time in his life, found wisdom and courage when he said,
Je vais vous dire une chose, l'Europe, de tous les continents du monde, est le continent le plus brutal où il y a eu les guerres les plus sauvages. C'est pas l'Afrique, c'est pas l'Asie, c'est l'Europe.
I'll tell you one thing, Europe, of all the continents in the world, is the most brutal continent, where the most savage wars have taken place. It's not Africa, it's not Asia, it's Europe. And I'll tell you something else, it wasn't in the Middle Ages, it was in the 20th century. Our continent is brutal, savage, and can descend into barbarism. If we didn't have the European Union, we would have considerable conflict.
Je vais vous dire autre chose. C'est pas au Moyen-Âge, c'est au XXe siècle. Notre continent est brutal, sauvage, et peut verser dans la barbarie. Si vous n'avez pas l'Union européenne, vous avez des affrontements considérables.
With the ongoing war between NATO and Russia or the ongoing confrontation between the Americans and the Houthis in Yemen that shows the awakening of people in the world or their determination to fight against barbarism of Europeans and also exposes the limit of the so-called European military power, one can think that Europeans and their American cousins will no longer have a chance to be barbaric towards anybody. Black Africans must also be willing to sacrifice their sweat and blood if they want their countries to be sovereign and Africa to develop or advance for the betterment and well-being of black people. Anyway, black Africans must tackle the leadership, organizational, and institutional problems before they can think of solving other problems Africa has faced for decades, if not for centuries. Black Africans must not be forever dumb but permanently smart by doing exactly what is supposed to be done at a specific time in the collective interest of black people.
And many of us predicted this at the outset. It's like trying to punch a bag of Jello. The Houthis aren't going to be defeated with conventional means, and the United States, it exposed the limits of U.S. military power.
Surrender, basically. Of course, they didn't use those terms, but that's what it was. No, I find this just remarkable again. It's just quite extraordinary, and I don't think it should be overlooked or diminished. But again, we're talking about the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the world, and this is it. It essentially defeated, the U.S. Navy. If the U.S. Navy was unable to achieve its objectives in the Red Sea and vis-a-vis the Houthis, how is it going to do so against the Iranians? How is it going to do so against the Chinese, who both of these countries are, much better equipped, much wealthier, much larger, have better technology? How could it succeed? A year ago or something, we say, well, the U.S. is really good at beating up on third world countries. And that was true back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, but it doesn't seem to be true anymore.